Julia Clark had always known that the world was changing, but she never expected it to come for her family's farm. The land had been in her family for over a century, passed down through generations, its soil carrying the weight of every hardship and triumph her ancestors had endured. The farmhouse, though worn by time, stood as a testament to their legacy, and Julia had spent her entire life caring for it. But the world beyond her property line had transformed. What was once open countryside had been replaced with neatly organized suburban developments, the kind with perfectly identical houses, pristine sidewalks, and HOA rules governing everything from fence heights to mailbox colors. Julia had watched from a distance as these changes crept closer, but she had never imagined they would reach her, until the day a letter arrived that threatened everything she had ever known. The envelope bore the official seal of the Sterling Crest Homeowners Association. Confused, she opened it and scanned the contents. According to the letter, her farm was now considered part of the Sterling Crest community, and as such, she was expected to adhere to their regulations. More importantly, it stated that the HOA had purchased all land within their jurisdiction, including, as they claimed, hers. Julia reread the letter twice, searching for the mistake. Her farm wasn't for sale. It had never been for sale. There was no way an HOA could just decide they owned it. But the language in the letter was confident, the wording carefully crafted to sound legally binding. She felt her stomach tighten as she reached the last line. She was being summoned to a mandatory HOA meeting where her compliance would be discussed. Julia tossed the letter onto the kitchen table, shaking her head. This had to be a mistake. But as the days passed and the date of the meeting approached, something in her gut told her this wasn't just a clerical error. She had seen what HOAs did to homeowners who didn't comply. Ridiculous fines, legal threats, constant harassment until they either fell in line or were forced out. And now, they were coming for her. She decided to attend the meeting, determined to shut down whatever false claims they were making. That was where she first came face-to-face with Thomas Grayson, the HOA president, a man whose polished demeanor couldn't hide the sharpness in his eyes. From the moment Julia stepped into the meeting, she knew exactly what this was. Grayson wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to take. He presented the HOA's claim over her land with rehearsed precision, citing legal loopholes and zoning adjustments she had never even heard of. The meeting wasn't a discussion, it was a demand. But Julia wasn't about to back down. She had fought for this land her whole life. And if Grayson thought he could take it with a few legal documents and empty threats, he was in for a fight he wasn't ready for. Julia left the meeting furious, knowing that this was just the beginning of a much bigger battle. Grayson had been smug, his confidence unshaken even when she had flat out refused to acknowledge the HOA's claim over her farm. He had barely reacted, simply tilting his head with a knowing smirk before reminding her that refusing to comply could have serious consequences. Julia knew what that meant. She had heard the stories. Neighbors forced out of their homes after being buried under impossible fines, legal fees, and endless harassment. The HOA didn't just demand compliance. They made life unbearable until people had no choice but to submit or leave. But they had never dealt with someone like her before. She wasn't going to roll over just because they sent a threatening letter and held a meeting full of legal jargon. The next morning, she sat at her kitchen table, spreading out every document she had: property records, tax filings, land deeds, anything that proved her family's ownership. She pored over them for hours, searching for any loophole, any technicality that the HOA could have latched onto. Nothing. Her property had never been part of any sale, never included in any suburban development plan. She had paid every tax, met every legal requirement. There was no possible way that Grayson's claim had any merit. So, how had they gotten away with this? Then she found it, a zoning map, recently updated. The original boundary lines were clear, cutting off Sterling Crest development well before reaching her land. But the newer version showed something different. Her farm was now marked within the HOA's jurisdiction, as if it had always been a part of their neatly organized community. Julia's heart pounded as she compared the two maps side by side. Someone had changed the zoning. This wasn't an error. This was deliberate. Someone had manipulated the records to make it appear as though her land was part of Sterling Crest. And that someone had to be Thomas Grayson. Julia clenched her fists. If they thought she was just going to accept this, they were dead wrong. She grabbed the new zoning map, folded it neatly, and shoved it into her bag. She needed answers, and there was only one place to get them. Within an hour, she was parked outside the Sterling Crest HOA office, a sleek, modern building that felt completely at odds with the land it now claimed to control. She stormed inside, demanding to see Grayson. The receptionist hesitated, but must have seen the determination in Julia's eyes because, moments later, Grayson emerged, looking as composed as ever. He smiled as if he had been expecting her. Julia didn't waste time. She slammed the zoning map onto his desk. "Explain this," she demanded. Grayson barely glanced at it before offering that same polished, empty smile. "Oh, Julia, there's no need for hostility," he said smoothly. "The county made some adjustments, that's all. Your farm now falls under our jurisdiction. It's really just a formality." Julia's stomach twisted at how easily he lied. This wasn't over. It was just getting started. Julia didn't believe a word he said, and she wasn't about to let him get away with it. Grayson's casual dismissal of the situation only confirmed what she already suspected. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a bureaucratic error. This was calculated. He had done this before. How many others had been bullied into submission by his smooth words and fabricated legalities? She refused to be one of them. She leaned forward, locking eyes with him, her voice steady. "You can dress it up however you want, but my land isn't for sale, and it's not under your control." Grayson's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or maybe amusement at her resistance. "Of course, Julia. No one is asking you to sell. We're just offering you the opportunity to be part of something bigger. The Sterling Crest community is thriving. With the right guidance, your property could be a wonderful addition." Julia felt her stomach churn at the way he spoke, as if he were doing her a favor. "And if I refuse?" His smile widened just slightly, his tone remaining frustratingly polite. "Then, of course, we'll have to proceed through the proper channels. There are regulations to consider. Compliance matters." The way he said it made her skin crawl. She had seen this tactic before. The slow tightening of rules, the endless waves of fines and citations, the bureaucratic pressure until resistance became impossible. He wasn't offering her a choice. He was warning her. Julia exhaled sharply and picked up the zoning map, folding it neatly before slipping it back in her bag. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her shaken. "Enjoy your day, Grayson," she said flatly before turning on her heel and walking out. The moment she stepped outside, she pulled out her phone and called the county records office. If someone had manipulated zoning boundaries, she needed to know how. The clerk on the other end of the line sounded uninterested at first, but perked up when she mentioned the Sterling Crest HOA. There had been a lot of paperwork filed recently, and Julia had a bad feeling about what she was about to uncover. It took nearly an hour, but when she finally got access to the right records, her suspicions were confirmed. The zoning change had been proposed 6 months ago, quietly pushed through under the pretense of community expansion. The documentation was vague, but one name stood out among the signatures: Thomas Grayson. Julia's grip on the phone tightened. He had orchestrated everything. This wasn't an accident. This was a takeover. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. If Grayson thought she would roll over like the others, he was in for a rude awakening. He had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated her. Julia returned home that evening with a new determination. If Grayson wanted a fight, he was going to get one. She had spent her entire life on this land, working through storms, droughts, and every other challenge nature had thrown her way. A piece of paper and a smug HOA president weren't going to scare her off. She sat at her dining table, the documents spread out before her, scanning through every zoning law and legal precedent she could find. There had to be a way to undo what Grayson had done. The problem was that the county had already approved the zoning change, meaning that legally it was in effect. Reversing it would require more than just proof. It would require influence, something Grayson clearly had plenty of. She needed a different approach. The next morning, Julia reached out to her closest neighbors, the ones who had owned their land long before Sterling Crest had swallowed up the countryside. Many of them had already been pushed out, but a few remained, and she was certain they had stories to tell. What she found was worse than she expected. Several of them had fought against the HOA's creeping influence in the past, only to be met with relentless harassment, baseless fines, surprise inspections, legal threats that drained their savings until they had no choice but to sell. One elderly farmer, Mr. Henderson, recounted how his property had mysteriously failed multiple safety inspections within weeks of refusing to sign onto the HOA's rules. Another neighbor, Sarah, told Julia about a family who had resisted for months, only to have their well condemned by the county after an anonymous complaint about water contamination. It was a pattern, one designed to break people down, piece by piece, until they had no choice but to leave. Julia's anger burned hotter with every story. Grayson wasn't just playing legal games. He was orchestrating a campaign of pressure and intimidation. But that meant there had to be a weak point in his strategy. If she could find it, she could expose everything. Later that afternoon, she went back to the county records office, this time looking for financial documents, specifically anything related to land acquisitions within Sterling Crest's expansion. It took some digging, but eventually she found something interesting. Several properties had been bought out in quick succession, all at prices far below their market value. The buyers were listed under different company names, but a little more research revealed a common thread. Each of those companies had ties to Grayson. Julia sat back, her heart pounding. This wasn't just an HOA enforcing rules. This was a calculated land grab, disguised as legal oversight. And now that she knew what she was up against, she had no intention of letting them get away with it. Julia knew she couldn't take on Grayson alone. She needed help, and she knew exactly where to start. If there was one person who understood zoning laws and legal loopholes as well as Grayson did, it was her old friend, Mark Delaney, a retired real estate attorney who had spent years fighting against corporate land takeovers. She hadn't spoken to him in a while, but if there was anyone who could help her, it was him. That evening, she drove out to his small home on the outskirts of town, a modest place surrounded by dense trees, far from the reach of HOA restrictions. Mark answered the door, his eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity before breaking into a warm smile. "Julia Clark, I was wondering when you'd finally get yourself into some trouble worth talking about." Julia managed a small laugh, but she wasted no time explaining why she was there. She laid out everything: Grayson's fabricated zoning changes, the harassment of other landowners, and the suspiciously low-priced land acquisitions that all led back to him. Mark listened in silence, his expression darkening with every detail. When she finished, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Sounds like classic HOA extortion, but this is worse than usual. He's not just enforcing rules. He's playing a long game to force people out." Julia nodded. "That's exactly what I think. But I need proof. Something solid, something that ties him directly to this scheme in a way he can't talk his way out of." Mark stroked his chin thoughtfully. If the county approved those zoning changes, someone on the inside helped him. Those don't just happen overnight. There's paperwork, hearings, votes. If you can find who signed off on them, you might have your smoking gun. Julia's stomach twisted. That meant her fight wasn't just against Grayson. It was against the system that had allowed this to happen. "Do you think you can help me?" she asked. Mark smirked. "Oh, I was going to help you whether you asked or not. But if we're doing this, we do it right. No half measures. We get the evidence and we take it public." Julia exhaled, relief flooding through her. For the first time since this all started, she felt like she had a real shot at winning. Mark leaned forward, his expression turning serious. "But be careful, Julia. People like Grayson don't like being exposed. If he realizes what you're up to, he'll push back hard." Julia met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. "Let him try." Over the next few days, Julia and Mark worked together, piecing together every detail of Grayson's scheme. Julia dug through public records, searching for any inconsistencies in the zoning changes, while Mark used his connections to discreetly gather information from people who had been involved in past land disputes. What they uncovered only confirmed their worst fears. Grayson had been manipulating records for years, expanding the HOA's control inch by inch, using legal loopholes and quiet deals with county officials to make it all seem legitimate. Every property he had acquired followed the same pattern. The owners faced sudden fines, inspections, and legal threats until they were forced to sell at a fraction of their land's actual value. Julia's stomach churned as she read through the reports. This wasn't just about her land. This was bigger. Sterling Crest wasn't an HOA. It was a machine built to consume everything in its path, and Grayson was the one pulling the strings. Mark, meanwhile, had focused on finding the weak link, the person who had signed off on the zoning changes. It didn't take long. A county clerk named Evan Ridley had approved the final adjustments, and a little more digging revealed something interesting. Ridley had recently purchased a brand-new home in a high-end development, paid for in cash. Mark leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. That's not a coincidence, Julia. Someone paid him off. Julia clenched her fists. And I think we know who. But proving it was another matter. They needed something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away as a misunderstanding or bureaucratic oversight. That meant finding a paper trail, emails, bank transfers, anything that directly linked Ridley to Grayson. But Julia knew one thing for certain. Grayson wasn't going to let them dig forever without noticing. They were running out of time. That night, as Julia sat at her kitchen table reviewing documents, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. A low voice came through the line. You need to stop. Julia stiffened. Who is this? Silence. Then the voice spoke again, calm, measured. Walk away. It's not worth it. Then the line went dead. Julia gripped the phone, her pulse pounding. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. This was a warning, a threat. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She wasn't backing down. If anything, this only proved they were getting close to something Grayson didn't want them to find. And that meant it was time to push harder. The next morning, Julia met Mark at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, her mind still racing from the phone call. She hadn't slept much, replaying the conversation in her head, analyzing every word, every pause. Someone was watching, someone knew exactly what she was doing, and they wanted her to stop. But that only made her more determined. Mark was already at a corner table, sipping coffee, his eyes sharp with curiosity the moment she sat down. You look like hell, he muttered. Julia ignored the comment and leaned in. Someone called me last night. They told me to stop. Mark set his cup down carefully. Threatening or just a warning? Julia hesitated. It was subtle, but the message was clear. They know we're getting close. Mark exhaled, rubbing his temples. That's not good. It means Grayson has eyes everywhere. Julia already knew that. She had spent the morning checking her surroundings, noting unfamiliar cars on her street, faces she didn't recognize. It could have been paranoia, but after the call, she wasn't willing to take chances. Mark leaned forward. We're running out of time. We need something solid, something we could take to the county or the press before Grayson finds a way to shut us down. Julia nodded. The problem is Ridley isn't going to just hand us the proof we need. If he took money from Grayson, he knows what's at stake. He won't admit to anything unless we give him a reason to. Mark's lips pressed into a thin line. Then we give him a reason. Julia raised an eyebrow. How? Mark pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. I know someone who used to work in county zoning. He might be able to tell us where Ridley keeps his records. If we can get a look at his files, we might find something linking him to Grayson. Julia wasn't sure how legal that was, but at this point, she wasn't above bending the rules if it meant saving her land. She nodded. Do it. Mark made the call, and within minutes, they had an address. Ridley's office, a small, nondescript building near the courthouse. It was a long shot, but it was their best option. Julia tapped her fingers against the table, her mind already running through possible outcomes. If Ridley had been sloppy, if there was even a single document connecting him to Grayson, they could blow this entire scheme wide open. But if they got caught snooping where they didn't belong, Mark must have seen the concern on her face because he smirked. Relax, Julia. We're just paying him a visit. Totally above board. Unless he gives us a reason to dig deeper. Julia sighed. This was getting dangerous, but there was no turning back now. If Grayson thought she would scare easily, he had no idea who he was dealing with. Julia and Mark arrived at Ridley's office later that afternoon, ready to see just how much trouble they could stir up. The building was small, tucked between a bail bonds office and an abandoned storefront, with a single glass door that had Evan Ridley, county zoning, stenciled across it. From the outside, it looked unremarkable, just another bureaucratic hole in the wall. But inside, it held the answers they needed. Julia took a deep breath before pushing open the door. The office was dimly lit, cluttered with overstuffed filing cabinets and stacks of paperwork that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Ridley sat behind a worn-out desk, typing lazily on his keyboard, barely glancing up as they stepped inside. If he was expecting them, he didn't show it. "Can I help you?" His voice was tired, uninterested, like a man who had long since stopped caring about his job. Julia wasted no time. "We have some questions about the recent zoning adjustments that place my land under Sterling Crest jurisdiction." Ridley sighed, rubbing his temples. "Look, if this is about HOA disputes, I'm not the guy you want to talk to. The county approved the adjustments months ago. It's all legal. Nothing I can do." Julia stepped closer, placing the altered zoning map on his desk. "Maybe, but I noticed something strange. The original zoning kept my farm separate. Then suddenly, a few months ago, the line shifted, and your signature is all over the approval documents." Ridley stiffened just slightly. It was subtle, but Julia saw it. The flicker of unease, the way his fingers twitched before he leaned back in his chair. "Paperwork gets processed. Sometimes things change. Nothing illegal about that." Mark, who had been silent until now, leaned in with a smirk. "Right. And I suppose that shiny new house you bought around the same time was just a coincidence?" Ridley's expression darkened. "That's none of your business." Julia didn't back down. "Maybe not. But if someone were to dig through financial records, I wonder if they'd find a trail leading back to Thomas Grayson." Ridley exhaled sharply, looking away. He was cracking. Julia pressed harder. "You signed off on those changes. Maybe you didn't think it was a big deal at the time. Maybe Grayson made it seem like just another harmless adjustment. But now people are paying attention. The county, the press. It's only a matter of time before someone starts asking the right questions." She leaned forward. "And when they do you really think Grayson will protect you?" Ridley's jaw clenched. The room was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he muttered, low and bitter, "You have no idea what you're messing with." Julia exchanged a glance with Mark. That was as good as a confession. They were close, closer than ever. But Ridley wasn't ready to break just yet. And that meant things were about to get even more dangerous. That night, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that they had just made themselves targets. Ridley's reaction had confirmed what she and Mark already suspected. He was compromised, but he wasn't ready to turn against Grayson. That meant one of two things. Either he was in too deep, or he was afraid of what would happen if he talked. Either way, they had rattled him, and that made things even more dangerous. She double-checked the locks on her doors and windows before finally sitting down at the kitchen table, staring at the mess of documents spread out in front of her. The weight of it all was pressing down on her now. This wasn't just a fight over zoning laws anymore. This was a battle against a system designed to crush people like her, and she knew Grayson wasn't going to back down quietly. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was Mark. "You all right?" Julia sighed. "I don't know. I feel like we just kicked a hornet's nest." Mark let out a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, well, sometimes that's the only way to find out how deep the hive goes." Julia rubbed her temple. "Ridley's hiding something. He looked scared, Mark. Not just nervous, scared." Mark was quiet for a moment before answering. "Then we need to figure out what he's afraid of. People like him don't stay loyal for no reason. Either Grayson has something on him, or he's seen what happens when people cross him." Julia exhaled slowly. That was exactly what worried her. Sterling Crest had taken over too much land, forced out too many families, and no one had ever fought back like this. What if there was a reason? What if Grayson's reach went further than they realized? Before she could voice her thoughts, headlights swept across her window. Her heart jumped in her throat as she moved toward the curtain, peeking outside. A black SUV was idling at the end of her driveway. She couldn't see who was inside, but it wasn't a neighbor, and no one had any reason to be out there this late. Julia's grip tightened around her phone. "Mark, someone's outside." The line went silent for a second before Mark's voice came back, low and serious. "Stay inside." Lock the doors. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Julia didn't argue. She stepped away from the window, forcing herself to stay calm. This was intimidation, plain and simple. Grayson wanted her to know she was being watched, that they could show up at her home, her land, whenever they pleased. But if he thought fear would make her stop, he was wrong. She had spent her whole life fighting for this farm, and she wasn't about to let a corrupt HOA president scare her into submission. Julia clenched her fists. If Grayson wanted a war, he had just made it personal. By morning, the SUV was gone, but Julia knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The message had been clear. Grayson and his people were watching, waiting for her to make a mistake. But instead of fear, the sight of that empty driveway fueled her determination. If they thought she would back down, they didn't know who they were dealing with. She grabbed her phone and called Mark. He picked up on the first ring. Saw anything else? He asked immediately. Julia shook her head, still staring out the window. No, but they wanted me to see them. They wanted me to know they were here. Mark sighed. That means we're close. Too close. Julia ran a hand through her hair. We need to move fast. If Ridley won't talk willingly, we need to find another way to connect him to Grayson. Mark was silent for a moment. Then he said, I might have an idea. Meet me in an hour. He hung up before she could ask for details. An hour later, Julia pulled into the parking lot of a small diner just outside of town. Mark was already inside, sitting at a booth with a laptop open in front of him. She slid into the seat across from him. What did you find? Mark turned the screen toward her. Bank records. Specifically, transfers between shell companies connected to Grayson and one very interesting account belonging to Evan Ridley. Julia leaned in, scanning the numbers. Large sums of money, deposited just before the zoning changes had been approved. This was it, the proof they needed. This is solid, Julia whispered. If we take this to the county, Grayson's finished. Mark didn't look as convinced. If we take this to the county, you think they'll just act on it? He has people inside, Julia. He's been playing this game for years. If we hand it over the wrong way, he'll have time to cover his tracks, spin the narrative, maybe even make us look like the criminals. Julia hated that he was right. Grayson had the kind of power that didn't just disappear overnight. If they wanted to take him down, they had to be smart. Then we take it public, she said. Mark raised an eyebrow. You're talking media? That's risky. Julia nodded. It's the only way. If this goes public before he can contain it, he won't be able to control the story. Mark sighed but nodded. All right. I know a reporter who might be interested. But Julia, if we do this, there's no turning back. Julia met his gaze, her expression unshakable. There was never any turning back. Julia and Mark spent the next day gathering everything they needed, preparing for the moment they would expose Grayson to the world. Every document, every bank record, every fraudulent zoning adjustment, they compiled it all into a single, undeniable case. Julia didn't just want to prove her land wasn't part of Sterling Crest. She wanted to take Grayson down for good. By the time the sun set, they had everything ready. Now, they just needed the right person to break the story. Mark had already reached out to an investigative journalist he trusted, a woman named Lisa Caldwell, known for her relentless pursuit of corruption cases. She had agreed to meet them that evening at a quiet cafe, away from prying eyes. When Julia and Mark arrived, Lisa was already there, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened intently as they laid out everything they had, her fingers tapping against the table as she scanned through the documents. When they finished, she let out a low whistle. This is serious. If this is all legitimate, Grayson isn't just running an aggressive HOA. He's running a full-scale land fraud operation. Julia nodded. That's why we came to you. If we take this through official channels, Grayson will bury it before anyone can act. But if this goes public first, he won't be able to control the damage. Lisa finished. She glanced between them, her expression unreadable. You realize what you're doing, right? If I run this story, you're painting a target on your backs. Julia's stomach twisted, but she pushed the fear aside. Grayson had already made it clear that he saw her as a problem. At this point, exposing him was the only way to make sure he couldn't retaliate in the shadows. We know, Julia said firmly, but this needs to come out. Lisa studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. All right, I'll verify the records, do my own digging, and if everything checks out, I'll publish it. But be ready. If this story breaks the way I think it will, Grayson won't be your only problem." Julia exhaled slowly. She had expected that. Sterling Crest wasn't just Grayson's playground. It was a carefully built empire. Taking him down would shake a lot of people. But that was a risk she was willing to take. Lisa stood, gathering the documents. "You'll hear from me soon. Stay alert." With that, she walked out, leaving Julia and Mark alone at the table. Mark let out a breath. "Well, that's it. No going back now." Julia clenched her fists. There never was. The following morning, Julia woke up to chaos. Grayson's empire was crumbling, and the whole town knew it. Lisa had wasted no time. The article had gone live overnight, and by sunrise, it had spread like wildfire. The headline alone was enough to send shockwaves through the community. HOA president caught in illegal land grab scheme. Corruption runs deep in Sterling Crest. Julia scrolled through the article, her pulse racing. Lisa had done her homework. Every fraudulent zoning change, every under-the-table deal, every forced eviction, it was all there, backed by undeniable proof. Grayson had spent years building his kingdom, but in less than 12 hours, it was collapsing around him. She barely had time to process it before her phone rang. It was Mark. "Turn on the news." Julia grabbed the remote, flipping through channels until she found the local news station. There he was, Thomas Grayson, standing outside the Sterling Crest HOA office, bombarded by reporters, his usual calm demeanor visibly shaken. "Mr. Grayson, do you deny the accusations?" One reporter shouted. "Are the county officials involved in your scheme?" Another demanded. Grayson lifted his hands, his voice strained as he tried to contain the firestorm. "These allegations are completely false. This is nothing more than an attack on the integrity of our community." Julia scoffed. He was losing control, and he knew it. Mark's voice came through the phone again. "It's happening, Julia. The county's launching an official investigation. The HOA board is in full panic mode. They're trying to distance themselves from Grayson." Julia exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. "Good. But this isn't over yet." Mark hesitated. "You think he's still got to move left?" Julia's gut told her yes. Grayson wasn't the type to go down quietly. He had been backed into a corner, and desperate men did desperate things. As if on cue, another call came in, an unknown number. Julia's stomach tightened. "Hold on, Mark. I have to take this." She switched lines, bracing herself. A slow, deliberate voice came through. "Congratulations, Julia. You made quite the mess." Her breath hitched. "Grayson, you think you've won, don't you?" His voice was cold, laced with something darker than anger, contempt. "You have no idea what you've started." Julia clenched her jaw. "I didn't start this. You did. And now everyone knows." A low chuckle came through the line. "This town has a short memory. People forget scandals. Money makes problems disappear. But you've made this personal. And I don't forget." The line went dead. Julia lowered the phone slowly, her fingers tightening around it. Mark's voice came through the other end. "Julia? What happened?" She took a breath. "Grayson just made a promise. He's not done." Mark cursed under his breath. "Then we finish this before he can make a comeback." Julia nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. Grayson might think he could still win, but he had already lost. As the investigation deepened, more people started coming forward, revealing just how deep Grayson's corruption ran. Former homeowners who had been forced out of their properties spoke up, recounting how they had been harassed, fined into financial ruin, and pressured into selling. Contractors who had worked on Sterling Crest developments admitted that they had been paid extra to look the other way when zoning violations occurred. Even former HOA board members, fearing legal repercussions, started leaking information about Grayson's backroom deals and illegal land acquisitions. Julia watched as the pieces of his empire fell apart, one confession at a time. The county, now under public pressure, had no choice but to take swift action. An official review of all recent zoning changes was launched, and subpoenas were issued to key players in the scandal, including Grayson himself. But Julia knew that wasn't enough. He wasn't just going to sit back and let this happen. He still had resources, connections, and enough arrogance to believe he could find a way out. And that made him dangerous. The tension in town was palpable. Julia noticed unfamiliar cars parked near her property, felt the weight of unseen eyes watching her every move. She wasn't paranoid. She knew Grayson wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Mark had warned her to stay cautious, and for the first time, she truly understood why. That evening, as she locked up her house, her phone buzzed with a new message. "Meet me at the old mill. No cops. We need to talk." Julia's pulse quickened. Ridley had been silent since their last encounter. If he was reaching out now, it could only mean one thing. He had something to say, something he couldn't risk being overheard. She immediately called Mark. "Ridley just texted me. He wants to meet." Mark's response was instant. "That's a bad idea, Julia. He's in deep with Grayson. This could be a trap." Julia hesitated. "Or it could be our last chance to get the truth." There was a long pause. Then Mark sighed. "All right, but you're not going alone. I'll meet you there." Julia grabbed her jacket and headed out, her mind racing. If Ridley was finally ready to talk, this could be the moment that sealed Grayson's fate for good. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. Julia and Mark arrived at the abandoned mill, the night air thick with tension as they prepared for whatever Ridley had to say. The old structure loomed in the darkness, its broken windows and rusted metal beams adding to the unease settling in Julia's gut. She scanned the area, but aside from the distant hum of insects, everything was eerily silent. Mark parked the truck a few yards away, killing the engine. "This feels wrong," he muttered, gripping the steering wheel. If Ridley was really ready to talk, why not do it somewhere safer? Julia exhaled sharply. Because he's scared. And scared people don't always make rational choices. Still, she couldn't deny that something felt off. She reached in her bag, feeling for the small voice recorder she had brought with her. If Ridley was finally ready to give them something concrete, she wanted proof. The two stepped out, moving cautiously toward the entrance. The mill's interior was cold, the smell of damp wood and rust thick in the air. Moonlight streamed through the cracks in the walls, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. Julia's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. Then, from the far end of the room, a figure emerged. Ridley. He looked worse than before, his clothes disheveled, his face pale and glistening with sweat. His hands trembled as he glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to follow him. "You came alone?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not exactly," Julia replied, gesturing to Mark. Ridley hesitated, then nodded. "Good. You need to listen carefully. I don't have much time." Julia's pulse quickened. "What do you have?" Ridley wiped a shaky hand across his face. "Everything. The records, the real zoning documents before they were altered, proof that Grayson paid county officials to look the other way. It's all in a file, but I don't have it with me." Mark folded his arms. "That's convenient. I had to hide it." Ridley snapped, his nerves fraying. "Grayson already knows I've been talking. He's watching me, Julia. If he finds out I gave you this, I'm dead." Julia's grip tightened. "Then why are you here?" Ridley exhaled sharply. "Because if I go missing, you'll know exactly why." A loud crack outside made them all freeze. Footsteps. More than one set. Julia's stomach dropped. "We need to go. Now." But before they could move, the doors at the far end of the mill slammed open, and the beam of a flashlight cut through the darkness. A voice echoed through the empty space. Well, I was hoping I wouldn't have to clean up this mess myself." Grayson. And he wasn't alone. Julia's heart pounded as Grayson stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but the threat in his eyes unmistakable. Behind him, two men flanked the entrance, their silhouettes blocking the only exit. Ridley took a step back, his breath coming in short, panic gasps. "I told you," he muttered under his breath. "I told you he'd come." Julia squared her shoulders, refusing to let fear take hold. "You're out of options, Grayson. The truth is out. The whole town knows what you've done." Grayson chuckled, slow and deliberate, as he stepped closer. "You think a few news articles are enough to bring me down? I built this place, Julia. People owe me favors, powerful people. The county, The courts, you really think they'll side with you over me? Mark clenched his fists. It's over. We have proof. And Ridley. He glanced toward the trembling man beside them. He's ready to talk. Grayson's smirk faltered for the first time. His eyes flicked toward Ridley, something dark flashing across his face. Is that so? Ridley swallowed hard, his body trembling. I didn't sign up for this, Grayson. I didn't know how deep it went. You knew enough, Grayson said coolly. And you were happy to take my money. Julia took a step forward. We already sent the evidence to Lisa Caldwell. It's out of your hands. Whatever power you think you have, it's slipping. The county's turning on you. The HOA board is panicking. You're alone. For the first time, real anger flashed in Grayson's eyes. He clenched his jaw, but then something shifted, his shoulders loosened, and he let out a slow breath. You're right. I underestimated you. Julia braced herself for whatever was coming next. Grayson turned slightly, giving a small nod to the two men behind him. Walk away, Julia. This is your last chance. Take your land. Enjoy your little victory. But if you push this any further, I promise you won't like what happens next. Julia held his gaze. I'm not afraid of you. Grayson's smirk returned, but there was something hollow behind it now. You should be. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his men following without a backward glance. Julia let out a slow breath, her pulse still racing. Ridley exhaled sharply, his body sagging with relief. That was close. Mark shook his head. No, that was a warning. Julia knew it wasn't over. Grayson would fight until the bitter end, but for now, he had lost. And she had won. Her land was hers, and she would never let anyone take it from her again.